Okay, yeah. Yeah, luckily it's not where I am. So, but yeah.
No, well, we've got some good lighting, but we're live and we're back, everyone. Welcome to the Global Gambit. My name's Pyotr, and today I'm being joined by Alia Brahimi, who is a non-residential fellow at the Atlantic Council and a scholar of international relations with a particular focus on the Middle East and North Africa. You've held quite a few different positions in your career, Alia, and it's lovely to have you on the show. I think the timeliness of your expertise is very strong, especially given just over 48 hours ago, there was this idea that Trump was going to be launching a renewed attack that Israel and America would be escalating against with war and kinetic action. And then due to the pressure of the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia especially, this seems to have been postponed. So I was wondering if you could take us through some of your perspectives on that. How much sway do you think MBS Riyadh has in behind the scenes, and where do you think this could go right now?
Well, yeah, I think the fact that, Trump said a couple of days ago that he was going to resume the strikes, and then he held off, as you say, on account of the intervention of the Gulf states, who essentially, want to avoid that. And I think there are a couple of things about this, Pyotr, which is Trump himself had walked himself up that escalation ladder, right, by tweeting out his frustration about the clock ticking and issuing these kind of civilizational threats. So he said something like, there won't be anything left of you. But nobody had forced him to say those things. But then they're quite difficult to walk back, right? So I'm not sure that saving face should be the basis of policy, or indeed on a war for that matter. So that was one element. And I think the second element is actually, as you suggest, the emerging distance between the US president and his Gulf partners, where they're using whatever leverage they have to restrain him from a course of action that they see as dangerous and sort of anathema to their interests. Do you remember a few days ago, I think it was last week, they closed their airspaces so that he couldn't resume bombing. They literally had to close their airspaces. So I think it's about the tensions and the seams within the alliance itself, and how Trump's probably only real ally in all of this is actually Israel. And then it prompts the question that if he does resume the war, does he now have a strategy? What is the end state that he's working towards? It's not clear that any of those questions have been answered.
No, it's not. And from my understanding, Saudi Arabia has been doing a lot of backdoor diplomacy, right, to try to sway the decision making of Tehran, and this whole idea that Trump even needs to return to conflict, I think, demonstrates that really Iran has the momentum, right? They're not exactly doing well. They're not free of issues, but certainly Trump he's not in the driving seat of the negotiations, or their lack of. And so that he feels the need to go back to war, to try to force the hand of the IRGC, the Islamic Republic, right?
Yeah, it's the other trap. So Robert Pape from the University of Chicago has written very compellingly on the escalation trap. And I think the Iranians have Trump trapped within it. But President Xi of China said the other day, he referenced the Thucydides trap when Trump was in China. Do you remember that a few days ago? And it got me thinking about the Peloponnesian War, and how in the end, actually, neither Sparta nor Athens meaningfully won in the long run. So this, it ended up weakening the Greek kind of world and laying the groundwork for later conquest, okay? So I'm thinking there's also a possibility here that there will be no winners. And it reminds me of that line. I don't know if you ever saw The Wire, the TV show The Wire, but Presbelusky says at one point, nobody wins, one side just loses more slowly. And I think that would be the best possible outcome from Iran as things stand right now, because absent like a game-changing move, success would be a return to the status quo ante. Iran opens the strait, the US forces leave the region, game over, plus maybe some version of the Obama nuclear deal of 10 years ago. So none of this is in a good place, as you say, and there's the potential for this to be a strategic defeat, actually, for the US, even if Iran doesn't win particularly.
No, but I think it goes further than that. Wouldn't you agree that this is even more than just it's an absolute loss in international relations. You've got in relative absolute losses, and in this regard, it's an absolute loss, because you mentioned the status quo, but I would argue that we're never going to go back to that. We're going to go back to something worse, or we're not. We're going to change. The status quo is forever and inherently different. The Iranians are going to force the Strait of Hormuz to be monetized in some way. My question is, how well could they actually do that? So, where do you see this going right now? Because as far as I can tell, we've got the time horizon is, I don't know. I was hoping this whole thing would be finished before the end of April, May. Trump would do some intense military operations, and then it's done and dusted. But now we're approaching the end of May, and there is no indication whatsoever that this thing is drawing down at all. And I'm just astounded that the American public have the desire to support Trump. Trump's just beaten, or Trump's supporter, I don't know his name, has just beaten out Thomas Massey. Yes. in one of those House of Representative, whatever, run. So Trump seems to have the mandate in the US, or am I missing something here? What do you say?
Yeah, I mean, maybe amongst a small section of the electorate, but I think not nationally. And I think that the midterms still lose large despite those primary wins for Trump candidates. I think he would very much like to, and he needs this to be over by then, and he needs this to be over soon. Do you remember when he was tweeting out, just open the fucking strait? And, there is that frustration, because that's not just impatience that it's signaling, but it's also kind of like impotence in a way. So, I think there is an understanding that this needs to be over as soon as possible, but, how? And you talked about where this is going. You asked about where this is going. But I think it's important to remember where this has come from. So, I put to you, Pyotr, that actually we keep fighting the lost war, right? So, I think of it in my head as after the first Gulf War in 1991, the US then looked at Somalia. Do you remember Operation Restore Comfort? I think it was called, in Somalia, but it looked at Somalia and the situation, this warlord General Hadid, through the prism of omnipotence. And they thought, okay, we'll do that. Black Hawk down, 18 US Rangers dead, right? So a few years later, when Rwanda came along, a genocide, the decision was not to intervene, and 1 million people were slaughtered in 100 days. So then when Kosovo happened in 1998, bear with me, there was this idea of we have to do something. And so the NATO bombing campaign happened, and it was considered effective. And I think that confidence carried over into Iraq and Afghanistan, which of course ended up being quagmires. And so we had this retreat. And Obama actually looked at Syria and was like, hell no, because of Iraq. But I think Trump's whole agenda, right, was to shake off ideas about US weakness, ironically. And so he did Venezuela. And that was a very contained, kind of superficial leadership change. And he was very much hoping and possibly reassured that something similar could be achieved in Iran. And we heard just today that Ahmadinejad, the former Iranian president, was touted and kind of secured as someone to potentially take over. Hugely problematic. But there were these Caracas goggles, as my colleague at the Atlantic Council, Alex Plitzas, calls them. But the worry is that next time we have a real crisis affecting US national security, this blunder, as you suggest, will loom large. What will be Trump's Syria? Will it be, China, Taiwan? No, I think you're absolutely right. Your premise is right. This will continue to cascade and reverberate. And, in that sense, geopolitically, nothing will ever be the same.
Well, I've just seen, recent headlines as of today. Trump says, quote, he's in no hurry to find a solution to this war, whilst the Iranians are saying that Trump is looking for an excuse to go back to war. So do you think that this is essentially one man's ego versus another entity's survival? Trump is so far in at this point that he doesn't want to have to admit that he needs to find a way out. So he's more willing to go again back to war, because he thinks that he can somehow overwhelm the Iranians through military might, which he didn't, than willing to have a bit of what's the expression, humble pie, and sort of find a way out. That's sort of where I see this right now. Is Trump's so far in, he cannot. He is too egotistical. He cannot accept the remote possibility of having to concede even a little bit.
Yeah, and yet all of those military tools are not achieving any of the stated objectives anyway, right? So the IRGC operates under something like 31 separate commands. It still has the 440 kilograms of uranium that's enriched to 60%. The Navy that they've touted that they've destroyed was never a meaningful asset or a form of power projection for Iran. Iran still has half of its original missile launchers and thousands of drones. It'll probably only take a year to rebuild the missile capabilities that it's lost. It's positioning them again on the coast. So there's not anything, that Trump can point to. And I think, do you remember in 2002 in Afghanistan, the Taliban said to the US, you have the watches, but we have the time. And the thing about the IRGC that's now ascendant in Tehran, they have both the watches and the time. This is a highly sophisticated regime, and it also operates with a baked-in element of strategic patience. And this is a huge problem for the Trump administration that they clearly hadn't bargained for.
Yeah, but do you not think that sometimes the idea of strategic patience is perhaps slightly overstated? Because for me, there's a difference between strategic patience and perhaps strategic endurance. One is a choice versus another, which is sort of no choice. I don't know if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do. I think that they would be. I think that they're proving that they would hold their own in both scenarios, actually. And I think that this notion, I think democratic politics give democratic leaders a glass jaw, in that ultimately they have to, whether having to go to Congress, he still hasn't got that congressional approval, which would be needed, in theory, or some argue, in order to restart. But also it's the electorate, it's, the election cycles coming up. So there are vulnerabilities that exist for the US that don't exist for a regime like Iran. And they can take all measure of pain that we can't. And I think that they're very confident. My point is just that they're quite confident they can ride this out. But of course, positions and peace, the negotiating points are being exchanged. There is something happening, we believe, in Pakistan. And the distance apparently is narrowing, according to some reports. But maximally, Iran wants to keep full sovereignty over the strait. They want war reparations. The gumption is quite something. They want sanctions to be lifted. They want the release of all their foreign assets. They want they might row back on this, but Americans to leave the bases in the Gulf. And they want to be able to enrich uranium. Whereas Trump wants that uranium out and moved to the US, and for Iran to keep only one nuclear site and no reparations, obviously, and minimal sanctions relief. So you have that, and also a question about sequencing, to your point. The US says that the war only ends when formal nuclear talks have started. Iran says nuclear talks can only happen after the war ends.
Yeah, it's a case of, well, it's almost like they're doing it deliberately. I think, in my opinion, the Iranians are basically just doing the opposite of whatever Trump says or signals he demands. And so the Iranians are like, yeah, no, okay, we'll just say, yeah, we're open to talking with you about that issue, just not when you want. Or sort of, we're open to talking with you right now, just not on the issues that you want, sort of thing. Yeah. So they're just tweaking it a little bit. A bit of mind games there.
Yeah, mind games, exactly. Yeah. Playing a little bit because they feel comfortable and they know he's in trouble. And, as you say, the grand narrative that we heard at the beginning of all of this is that, they would all be gone by now, let alone kind of toying with him. So I think that they're kind of, they are enjoying it. And the fact that they've watched so many of their comrades, die and be killed with their families, and still, they don't seem to be breaking a sweat, either, in terms of their information campaigns, but also with their meme game and on Twitter. And, they're basically saying, we're good with this now, and why not?
Yeah, but they don't have an infinite time window either, do they? They have a strong set of economic pressures. So what do you think breaks first in this regard? Because to me, the Iranians have perhaps a slightly better political hand, but economically they're running on fumes.
They are, but they've implemented a number of workarounds in terms of land corridors and that sort of thing. But yeah, no, they're also under the kibosh as well. And but it's just that they don't have that a citizenry that they have to be accountable to. And I think that also creates a difference. But also, their population has been bombed as well, and it sort of created a barrier against that kind of uprising that they were hoping would happen spontaneously. And according to reports, just to emphasize again, because it is so extraordinary, that Ahmadinejad, this former president of, I think he served for 10 years, was going to be put in somehow. That was the plan, was to put him in place, which I think shows the disconnect and the lack of realism in the planning of all of this. At first, there had been when the bombing started, there had been no contingency plan for US nationals in the region. There had been no contingency plan to defend against drones, defend the Gulf allies against drones. All of these things were foreseeable. There had been no contingency plan about the closure of the strait. And I think this latest revelation about Ahmadinejad shows how sort of deaf and blind the planning for all of this was, because there's no way that guy would have been accepted by the IRGC, by the Ayatollahs, but especially by the Iranian people. So I guess it just vindicates the idea that this has got nothing to do with the Iranian people.
No, well, of course it doesn't. And unfortunately, I think there's been at least 32 people who have been killed during this war. Since February 28th, at least 32 people have been assassinated or murdered, or whatever framing word you want to use, by the Islamic Republic dissidents, they would probably call them. But it shows that the regime is perfectly comfortable in doing the very things that the Trump administration sort of said that they would be coming to help liberate the Iranians from. But then,
he said early on, can we just recognize, Pyotr, that he said early on, within a day, I'd be open to negotiating with the regime.
Yeah, he did. And I think what's also crazy, and I'd like your take on this, is simply that you sort of alluded to it earlier on in our conversation, which is that Trump has talked about civilization erasure. He's talked about sending it back to the Stone Age. We'll bomb the hell out of them. We'll flatten it. So that someone who uses that kind of rhetoric, I think, reveals their true intentions or priorities around the war instead of the liberation of the Iranian people. And it's gone to such an extent that the Iranian people, are now recognizing or perhaps having reservations about this whole war in the first place. In January, February, they were like, "Yes, come. We want you want the US to destroy the Islamic Republic." But it's been such an ineffective campaign, at least in the overall strategic objectives, that the Iranian people are now like, "Well, this is not worth it." So, can you help me wrap my head around that?
Yeah, I think that we learned from the war in Iraq that chaos is a reality, even worse and even more deadly than dictatorship. I think the Iranian people understood that early on.
Have we lost Alia? Right, I'm not sure if Alia is frozen or if it's... Well, maybe we'll... Well, whilst Alia, just hopefully she can reconnect. I just thought to say, actually, that we've got an interesting update here from the Foreign Ministry of the United Arab Emirates, actually. Alia was discussing Iraq, and the UAE's denounced the strikes on them and the Gulf neighbors from what was the Iraqi territories, which I thought was pretty fascinating. What I thought was quite interesting about that was that the UAE really are beginning to go out on their own. It has directly called out Iran for backing the groups, but it is more and more confident in willing to recognize the sort of belligerency of Iran's proxies, but also that Iran's proxies are still in the area, right, guys? So you've got the Badr group, which is Badr organization, one of the entities in Iraq, which has not been quite as active, I think, as some people thought they would, a bit like the Houthis in Yemen. There hasn't been much involvement of them. There's been a few strikes intermittently here and there, But overall, the war has been primarily between Hezbollah and Iran itself, which one wonders sort of what that means for the state of the Iranian proxy network more broadly. But when they want to, the Iranian proxies, the Iraqi-backed militias down there, have the capacity to get involved, and UAE being the epicenter of this extended campaign. I think it was the statistics from a few weeks ago, was that while Qatar had been struck about 800 to 900 times, UAE had been struck over 3,000. And the intensity of that is I think reflected in these later sets of rounds. The other thing that I saw Trump had just mentioned in the past half an hour was simply that Netanyahu will do whatever I want him to do. That was the paraphrasing Trump used to Barak Ravid, who is the chief foreign affairs correspondent or global affairs correspondent for Axios. So it seems to be that Trump trying to demonstrate very clearly to the public, to his viewers, whatever, that he is in control, not Iran or not Israel, and the other way around. So make of that what you will, but it makes me wonder who's really pulling the strings here. How far does the Israelis have influence over the Americans or over Trump, as we've thought? But simply speaking, it looks like it's Trump trying to sort of retain that control there, and emphasize that he's calling the shots, not the other way around. But other than that, I mean, the tanker, that was the other main headline from the past few hours, was that the tanker in the Indian Ocean has been seized by the US, which I don't know how much that's going to play into the broader peace negotiations or their lack of, but it's a pretty big deal for the Americans to seize another tanker. That was one of the first things that happened early on in the war. If you remember, there was one of the Iranian vessels that was sunk just off the coast of Sri Lanka. And I'm pretty interested to see if that has any implications at all, because right now, to me, it doesn't. Then, of course, you've got the Iranians have basically threatened more attacks beyond the Middle East. It would expand the conflict if the US tried to restart its military campaign. So the talks have basically stalled at this point, and Trump's public comments have veered between the threats of restarting an entire bombing campaign, as we were chatting with Alia just a minute ago, and then declarations that peace is clear. So this whole idea late on Tuesday night was simply that, actually, peace talks are making significant progress. That's the only statement we heard about that. And then the talks, nothing else. And the talks don't seem to go anywhere else. There's no evidence. And I think that was Trump just trying to find or make up an excuse that the war was winding down, or that he doesn't have to reactivate the war. He doesn't have to go back to war. Ultimately, I don't really think he wants to. But as I said with Alia just a moment ago as well, the fact that he is so any progress whatsoever is forcing him to sort of constantly threaten action as a last resort. Hey guys, I will genuinely go back to war unless you come. That whole sort of escalatory rhetoric, right? I'm going to keep escalating verbally in the hope that the Iranians come round again, but doesn't seem like that. I think Alia has rejoined us, so let's bring her back. Alia, we lost you there. You're also on mute, Alia, so you just need to unmute. But I was just saying to the audience. No, I was just saying to the audience about the situation with Trump's rhetoric, that he's having to reiterate all these ideas of peace, the significant peace process that was being made on Monday, Tuesday, and then nowhere. But what I particularly wanted to get from you was your take on the UAE and its reactions to, because you've been mentioning parallels with the Iraq war. And that was something I wanted to hear more about from you, for you to dive in deeper, which was simply what was the role, and how do you look at the Iraqi militia in all of this? Because we've seen not very much activity from Iran's proxies. It's mainly been Hezbollah and Iran itself, right? We've seen the Houthis launch, I think, a single rocket about a month ago, but that was it. And other than that, it's not really led to anything. So what does it mean when the Iraqi groups decide to get involved or launch some missiles or strikes towards the UAE and Gulf states as they did yesterday and a couple of days back?
Yeah, I mean, they're very close to home. That's the thing. Iraq is very, very close to home. Kuwait shares a land border with Iraq. I mean, they genuinely fear a land invasion from Iran aligned militias from Iraq, but the Iraqi militia have been very active. They've been pummeling Iraqi Kurdistan, which is seen as an avatar for like US and Israeli interests. But the fact that some of these missiles that are hitting, drones and missiles that are hitting the Gulf are emerging from Iraq is really, really deepening this conflict, because the Gulf states need to make an accommodation with Iran, but also with Iraq as well. You know, these are two big states that they're surrounded by, and this is just, the longer this goes on, the more complicated it's becoming. So I think that that's what the Iraq factor represents. But, you know, you mentioned...
Looks like we're losing Alia yet again.
Are you
yeah, your internet's quite spotty there, Alia. I don't know if it's on my side or your side, but it looks a bit... yeah, you keep freezing, unfortunately.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
I don't know if anyone watching. No, it's very spotty.
I don't know. This has never happened. I'm so sorry.
It's fine for apparently it's viewers are saying it's fine for them. Okay, maybe it's my end. I'm not sure, but
Oh, okay. Well, I apologize if it's...
No, but just keep... Oh, okay, it's my end apparently. Well, if you just keep going, then I think it's all right.
Okay, well, you know, apologies for the stop and start to everyone out there. But, you know, this time last year, Pyotr, I was in Tokyo, exactly this time last year. And I was invited to Waseda University to talk about AI in the Middle East. So what I decided to argue was that faith in the US security guarantee, so this was a year ago, was collapsing, and that the Gulf states were going to pursue AI and militarized AI as a way of pursuing strategic autonomy and getting out from under the US security umbrella. And what had captured, you know, my imagination on this and what had catalyzed it, I don't know if the viewers are still there, but Pyotr's gone, but I'll continue. What had catalyzed this in my mind was the Houthi attack, which is a rebel group in Yemen. They had attacked Abu Dhabi. Are you guys still there? I don't know. I'll continue. So the Houthi had attacked Abu Dhabi in January 2022, right, before the Ukraine war. And the Emiratis were shocked by the lackluster US response, right? Biden effectively, you know, the CENTCOM commander didn't come for a long time, for 28 days. He only issued a few words, refused to sanction or designate the Houthi as terrorists. And this created a trauma within the UAE. So then a few weeks later, Russia invades Ukraine. And the Emiratis were like, what the actual, because of the response to Ukraine. And so the UAE refused to adopt Western talking points on the Ukraine war, and they refused to raise the oil output to help out the US. And there was this kind of like sulk, I guess. So then in Qatar, the scales fell from Qatar's eyes as well. And they already had from the Saudis, but I won't go into that. When in September last year, do you remember the Israelis bombed the Gaza negotiators in Doha in September? So my point is that this crisis in confidence, Pyotr, has been long in the making. You know, it didn't start 60, 70 days ago. And I think their worst fears have been realized because they knew, you know, that Iran is effectively taking the Gulf states as strategic hostages, you know, and it's really hard for them to make plans while this uncertainty prevails. They want to move forward, but they need to know, you know, how this ends, on what terms, which factions are ascendant in Tehran, whether Trump walks away, you know, and what is the position of US credibility, which part of the Iran problem set is even dealt with in any deal. Is it the ballistic missiles and drones? Is it the nuclear? Is it the proxies, as you say? Do those proxies extend to the militia in Iraq? And is it the Strait, right? So they want to know how much compromise there's going to be and how much strategic swagger the Iranians are left with, because this right now is being treated like a game. I would suggest, with the public information campaign from the White House, which is bad enough, but a game that the US, the security guarantor of the Gulf states, a game that it might be losing, I think that's a catastrophe for them. I can continue if you can't hear me. I can continue talking about, should I continue talking about the Gulf? Because in the Gulf, I don't know if the viewers can hear me or you, but I'll keep going. So you have this hierarchy of vulnerability in the Gulf. You have this hierarchy of suffering. So the same crisis has been experienced very differently. In terms of the attacks, the UAE has been attacked thousands of times and 3 times as many times as Israel, which is a belligerent in the conflict, right? But also economically, like the Saudis have a workaround to the closure of the strait. They're sending 2/3 of their pre-war oil output to a port in Yanbu on the Red Sea. And so whatever they've lost in volume, they've made up for in the high oil price. So they have this workaround. The UAE have one too, to the port of Fujairah in the Gulf of Oman, whereas Kuwait, for example, hasn't exported a single barrel of oil for the first time since the Gulf War in 1991. And Qatar too, they're both up the Gulf. It lacks an alternative route for gas exports. So you have, as I say, this different experience of the same crisis, and then you have different strategic assessments about the way forward. You okay? Am I with you now? I will.
Seems like.
Is there a lag?
I can't work with this.
I can make another point about the Gulf states making different strategic assessments, actually, of how to deal with Iran and where to put the emphasis on like coercion versus consent. So Saudis floated this idea of a non-aggression pact. I don't know if you heard about that, but Saudi has been opposed to the US and the Israeli bombing campaign to begin with, right? It's consistently tried to de-escalate tensions. It's been left out of the peace negotiations, but Saudi implicitly understands the latent power of a more angry, a more isolated, more militarized, more radical version of the regime that's been left behind by Trump. Pyotr's left, but guys, I'll continue. I can't interact with you, but I'll keep going. I used to be an academic and would basically indulge in one-way lectures. But we have this sort of more angry, as I say, more radical regime. And the Saudis understand the latent power of that. The UAE understand that too, but their solution or their paradigm is to be more hawkish. They don't want to be weighed down by the collective, which is why they've left OPEC. They want to get out from under Saudi's shadow and make their own decisions. They want to go it alone by strengthening cooperation with Israel. And in my view, a lot of that is just about access to that defense tech I was mentioning before, the militarized AI. And it may actually the UAE may want the military campaign on Iran to continue.
Absolutely. I don't know, Alia, if you can hear me well enough.
I can.
My Wi-Fi seems to be having. Someone says I'm having a stroke. Well, the internet certainly is, unfortunately. But what I do want to get your take on is about the Saudi UAE rift here, because the Saudi Emirati divergence, I think, is one of the most critical consequences of this whole war. Not so much even the war itself with Iran, but because this is fundamentally shaping the entire balance of power in the Middle East. We've got two blocks emerging, I think, with the Turkish, the Saudis, the Pakistanis on one side, and then the sort of the Israelis, the Emiratis and Indians, if you want to go broader, right? Because whatever Pakistan does, the Indians will counterbalance. So What do you think this means for the greater balance of power in the Middle East? But second, what does that do for the energy security and dynamics in the Gulf? Because obviously UAE leaving OPEC was a big deal. But with everything else going on, I didn't have enough time to cover it. But simply, what do you think make of this rift and therefore balance of power across the broader Middle East?
Well, the leadership styles are quite similar, so they're quite bold, on the face of it. These are two leaders that are trying to sort of remake the region in their own image, and they're not afraid. They feel that they have the support and the culture now to make big and bold decisions. But the thing with the strategic culture is very different. So the Emiratis are disruptors. We've seen that in Libya. We've seen that in Sudan. We've seen that in Yemen. The Saudis are more status quo. And I think the OPEC, part of the OPEC departure from the UAE was about anxiety about the post-oil order, right? So this idea that peak oil has come and gone. We don't need to be weighed down by Saudi Arabia's targets and, production caps. We need to get as much out of the ground as we can and leave nothing there. And that would be the sensible thing to do. So that was part of it. But a part of it as well was this idea of getting out from under Saudi Arabia's shadow. And I think the natural, as you intimate, the natural response to this, and probably the most rational one, would be to cooperate more than ever and to come closer together and to deal with this threat on their doorstep as a collective. But the UAE blinked first. You speak to Qatari officials and they'll say, look, let's not overplay this. There's a little bit of a difference of perspective, but, there's no rupture here. But I think, the tea leaves are suggesting that this is actually just an extension of a different perspective and different paradigms that have been operational for many years now. And we saw them play out in Yemen, and in Yemen very recently in January, where proxies basically came to blows. But as I was saying, when you were not, momentarily not with us, the Saudis have a very different approach to how to deal with this. They want a non-aggression pact. They want to engage Iran. They want to get assurances. They want to bed in with the allies that you suggest. The UAE is much more hawkish. And some of that is as a result of many things. But the Gulf states, some of them have a double vulnerability in that, and this is not to kind of essentialize their populations, but states like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and Kuwait, but Saudi has a very significant Shia minority. Bahrain has a very significant Shia majority. And they know, and historically this has happened, Iran can turn that tap on and off. It can incite certain segments of this the Shia population in these Gulf countries if it needs to. And that's not to say most of them see themselves as Saudi and they're not agents of Iran, but it just takes a few spoilers. Yeah. The Saudis are very aware of this. The Bahrainis lived through this very violently. And then there's the Houthi on the Red Sea who haven't been activated yet. So I think there are good arguments for making an accommodation with this wounded beast. But the UAE seems to be thinking, another perspective would say you need to just finish these guys off. But the question is, even if you believe that, can the US do that? And does it have the commitment and the capability and the will to do that, which is doubtful. And the Saudis feel it's doubtful.
Yeah, we hear you. Yeah, I'm sorry about this, Alia. I'm not sure what's happening with my internet, to be honest. But I appreciate how good you are at just continuing to talk through. I guess the last question I'll ask you, because we'll just have to have you back when I've got a stable internet connection. I apologize.
I hope you can use this because it's
you're making great points, and the audience seem to be resonating with everything you're saying. So don't worry about it. It's a me issue. It's a me thing, not a you thing.
It's not. Yeah, that's basically what the UAE just said to the GCC. It's not you, it's me.
Yeah, it's not me, it's you. It's not you, it's me. But simply, my last question is simply, right now Putin's in China, and Trump has just come back from China. And China is looking very much like it's holding the mantle right now. Xi Jinping looks very much in command of he's the man that people want to be seen with, who want to be hanging out with. how do you think that this rift in the Middle East is going to play out in the broader strategic competition between the bigger powers? So Russia, if you want to consider them in this equation, be my guest, but predominantly, obviously the United States and China, because in my eyes, you see the UAE really leaning in towards its relationship with the Israelis and therefore the United States. But conversely, the Saudis and the petrodollar, which is more of the point I'm emphasizing here, the Saudis are really beginning, I think, to question their relationship with the Americans, or Trump at least, therefore to diversify away to the Chinese. So how big are the consequences do you think this can have in that context? Or you think that's too difficult to envisage?
No, I don't. I think that all of this is happening within the context of like material power decentering and rebalancing, and a shift away from the unipolar moment and the sole, US hegemon, which has lost both the intention and the capability probably to be that hegemon. So that's the larger kind of superstructure, right? Then we have the abandonment of soft power, essentially Western soft power. I mean, I could talk about that for a long time. I won't, I won't. But it is extraordinary that we've gone in that direction. That at the same time as we're moving to a multipolar system, one of our strongest levers, we're just wholesale giving up. So the US is turning down the lights on that liberal international order that it established, that it helmed, and that it defended since the Second World War. And some of that was accelerated, it started with, this isn't all Trump, the war in Iraq, foreign policy after 9/11, whether, the detainees at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay, the invasion of Iraq, but also Biden, the precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan, the near total surrender of the laws of war in Gaza. We can talk about another time. But we've got to a point where the national defense strategy of the United States refers to the rules-based international order as a cloud castle abstraction. So we have those two things happening. Power rebalancing. So we're basically sanctioning a might makes right world, the one that Russia and China have agitated for and feel very comfortable in. So you have power rebalancing, you have the surrender of the soft power, but then where Iran comes in, and I'll end on this point, is that what you also have is a middle power at best, Iran, seems to be kind of exposing the limits of US power, right? For all the world to see. And it shows that the US also is isolated. And then you have this fourth element, the final element, which is that the US credibility is now in question. Yeah, four. US credibility is now in question.
I'm just showing that I am hearing you. I'm hearing you. I'm seeing you.
Yeah, you can make this a thing. I mean, I read
Sorry,
you.
No. Yeah, I do. I read you. I come in peace. Or something like that. Sorry, but please continue. It's
I will finish here. I'll spare you guys. But I just want to say there's this fourth element where the credibility of the US security guarantee is being questioned by the war in Iran. And there's the prospect that the US may abandon its allies to an emboldened Iran. That being allied to the US doesn't protect you from attack. It doesn't deter attacks, again, from a middle power at best. And the US is struggling actually to defend against some of those attacks. So you have to go to Ukraine for the drone expertise. But also it's expending these munitions, right? These stockpiles, they're potentially running out of Patriot missiles, and they have to take them from Ukraine, which is the worst possible look. So I think that all of this for the rest of the world, and certainly right now in Beijing, for Russia and for China, is hard to unsee. And then, as I said earlier, you have Trump going, just open the fucking straits. So this is really an extraordinary moment. They call this
but Alia, if I can just be devil's advocate on this, because I think it's an interesting point, but also worth debating over, right?
Yeah.
I think it's pretty clear that the United States, as the provider of the international security architecture, is over, right? Trump doesn't want to do that. No. And the broader American public, or at least the MAGA, those who support Trump, don't want to do that. So isn't it perhaps good that we're seeing a diversification of security assurance and provision, right? Maybe it's time for the US to be not replaced, but sharing that position and role with the Chinese or something. People are making this argument that if America doesn't want to provide that security assurance, therefore it won't be in place, it won't do so, and therefore it won't be suitable anyway. So, or do you think that this is an inherently unstable scenario because you need some kind of global power that acts as the policeman? You know,
I mean, that's a very good point. It's a very good realist point. I don't know, my truck with it, and I don't want to make a values-based judgment, but my truck with this is not so much the instability, is that if you have a multipolar order where Russia and China feature prominently, what values is that order securing? In the US, with the US-led order, we had a certain set of values that are also European values and Western values and arguably universal values. And I think that when you strip world order and you strip the security architecture away from those values, however hypocritical, we're in a kind of Hobbesian world again. And we're giving up on the progress that we supposedly made. I tend to believe, and I believe this in Gaza. I don't know if you saw Netanyahu the other day on 60 Minutes, but he said, we don't kill civilians. We're the most moral army in the world. What do you mean we don't kill civilians? And this is so important, and I'll tell you why. Because Michael Walzer, the political theorist, he wrote in Just and Unjust Wars in 1977, he wrote that in hypocrisy, you find moral knowledge. So Netanyahu, he knows it's wrong to kill civilians, right? And I would apply that. And so you can use that eventually to hold those people accountable. They're not saying it's okay to do it. They're saying it's wrong. We would never do it. Well, guess what? You did it. And we did the same, with Iraq, with Afghanistan, with Abu Ghraib, with Guantanamo. Those rules and those principles were used to an extent to hold people accountable. It's not ideal, but to an extent. If we totally evacuate the moral space, is the world going to be better off, or is it going to be worse off? Because I believe that double standard is important, because at least there are certain values and principles that hard power is trying to secure. And so that's something worth thinking about. But you look at the world now, and you can't, and with US predominance and how it's culminated with the Trump administration and with the depredations in Gaza, by the way, and the atrocities there, and you think, well, can it get any worse than this? I put it to you that it possibly can.
Well, then we'll just have to have you back to sort of touch upon how worse it's gotten in that subsequent period.
Yeah, of course. Good news always. Yeah.
Well, I don't think my internet can get any worse, at least relative to the situation. Put it that way. But Alia, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. Everyone watching, firstly, I want to apologize for my internet. Not sure what's going on. Secondly, I want to thank Alia Brahimi for joining us with an extensive array of knowledge. And thirdly, for just sort of persevering and continuing on whilst I was popping in and out like it was a sort of a burger van or something,
Salon.
like a rotating door. But everyone, do check out Alia's work. You can find it over as she's a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, and we'll be back. I'm going to predominantly doing pre-recorded videos. I am traveling at the moment in Africa, which may be part of the reason I have shitty internet, but I thought I have Starlink and I thought it would resolve it, but it didn't. But you'll see more of me with some fellow guests, including Alia, in the days and weeks to come. Thanks a lot, guys. Speak to you soon. Take care.
See you guys. Thanks.